Picture this, it's May 10th, 1940. You're a French general standing in one of the most advanced military fortifications ever constructed. Around you, steel and concrete descend 7 stories underground. Artillery turrets rotate with mechanical precision. Climate-controlled barracks hum quietly beneath your feet. Telephone lines connect every bunker. Ammunition flows through underground railways. The walls are thick enough to withstand the heaviest shells Germany can throw at you. You feel safe. You feel invincible. And in 72 hours, German tanks will be racing across France behind you. Not through your fortress. Not over it. Not even really around it in any complicated sense. They'll just drive past it. Through a forest you were told was impassable. Across terrain your advisors swore tanks couldn't cross. While you and 300,000 of your finest soldiers stand in your magnificent bunkers, facing the wrong direction entirely. This is the story of the Maginot Line, a masterpiece of engineering that became a monument to strategic blindness. A defensive wall so powerful it rendered itself completely irrelevant. And here's the strangest part, everyone saw it coming. The warnings were there. The alternatives were proposed. The mistake was optional. So here's the question that will haunt this entire investigation. If you were shown a map of France in 1939, with Belgium clearly marked as neutral territory, and someone told you that Germany had invaded through Belgium just 25 years earlier, would you have left your northern border undefended? Keep that thought. We'll come back to it. History is full of these forgotten lessons. Moments where brilliant minds made baffling choices, where nations bet everything on a single assumption. We're building an archive of these investigations, pulling back the curtain on decisions that shaped our world. To ensure you don't miss our next deep dive into the archives, join us by subscribing. Think of it as enlisting in a regiment of historians who refuse to let these stories fade. Now, let's step back. Because to understand how France built the perfect defense against the wrong war, we need to understand the nightmare they were trying to prevent. The men who designed the Maginot Line weren't fools. They were traumatized. Close your eyes and imagine, it's 1916. You're standing in a trench near Verdun, Verdun. The ground beneath your boots is churned mud mixed with fragments of men who stood there yesterday. The air tastes like copper and cordite. German artillery has been falling for 300 consecutive days. Not 300 shells, 300 days of shells. Millions of them. The mathematical absurdity alone should break your mind, over 1 million casualties for a few miles of scorched earth that looks like the surface of the moon. This is what the French generals remembered. This is what woke them at night. The Great War, the one they promised would be the last, had introduced industrial-scale slaughter to European soil. Barbed wire. Machine guns. Artillery barrages that could be heard in London. An entire generation fed into the meat grinder of trench warfare. And France had bled more than most. 1.4 million dead. Over 4 million wounded. Towns erased. Farmland poisoned. An entire demographic cohort simply gone. When the war finally ended in 1918, France didn't celebrate victories so much as survival. So when the question arose, how do we make sure this never happens again? The answer seemed obvious: build a wall. Not a medieval stone barrier, but something modern. Something German shells couldn't crack. Something so formidable that Germany would take one look and decide war simply wasn't worth it. Enter André Maginot, André Maginot. Maginot wasn't a career military officer. He was a politician who'd served as a sergeant during the Great War, wounded at Verdun, walking with a limp for the rest of his life. That limp mattered. Every step reminded him of what happened when France was unprepared. Every speech he gave carried the weight of personal experience. As France's Minister of War in the late 1920s, Maginot championed a radical proposal: construct a continuous line of fortifications along France's eastern border with Germany. Not trenches, those had failed. Not castles, those were obsolete. Something new. Something that merged the latest military technology with the permanence of concrete and steel. The French Parliament, still haunted by the same ghosts, agreed. They allocated 3 billion francs, a staggering sum for a nation still recovering economically. Construction began in 1930. And what they built was genuinely impressive. The Maginot Line stretched from Switzerland to Luxembourg, roughly 280 miles of interconnected fortresses. But calling them fortresses undersells the engineering marvel. These were underground cities. The main ouvrages, ouvrages, the large fortifications, descended multiple stories into the earth. Soldiers lived in climate-controlled quarters with dormitories, kitchens, hospitals, even recreational rooms. Everything was electrified. Narrow-gauge railways transported ammunition from deep magazines to artillery positions. Telephone networks connected every position. Ventilation systems filtered out poison gas, a lesson from the last war. The weapons systems were cutting edge. Retractable gun turrets could rise, fire, and descend before enemy artillery could respond. Some turrets mounted 75mm guns. Others held machine guns with overlapping fields of fire. The concrete walls were 3.5 meters thick in places, engineered to withstand direct hits from the heaviest German artillery. Between the major forts sat smaller positions, casemates, observation posts, anti-tank obstacles. Barbed wire. Minefields. The entire system was designed to channel any German attack into kill zones where French artillery could decimate them from protected positions. On paper, it was brilliant. French military doctrine envisioned a defensive war where Germany would smash itself against these fortifications while France mobilized its full military strength. The Germans would suffer catastrophic casualties. The war would bog down. International pressure would force a settlement. France would never again endure the bloodletting of Verdun. In 1939, French military leaders showed off the Maginot Line to international observers with undisguised pride. British officers toured the facilities and came away impressed. American journalists wrote glowing articles about the Great Wall of France. The French public, terrified of another war but reassured by these concrete monuments, felt something they hadn't felt in 20 years, safe. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems, and they were visible to anyone who looked at a map. The Maginot Line ended at the Belgian border. Not because they ran out of money. Not because the terrain became impossible. It ended because of an assumption, one that seemed reasonable at the time but would prove catastrophically wrong. Belgium was neutral. Belgium was France's ally. Belgium, French planners believed, would never allow German forces to cross its territory. And even if Germany tried, Belgium would resist, giving France time to mobilize and move forces north. The Belgian Ardennes, Ardennes, forest, thick, hilly, cut with rivers, was considered impassable to modern armor. French generals looked at those woods and saw a natural barrier as effective as any wall. So the northern border, the flat, open terrain leading from Belgium into northern France, remained largely unfortified. Oh, there were some positions. Some pillboxes. Nothing compared to the elaborate network facing Germany. If you're feeling a creeping sense of dread, you should be. Because in 1914, just 25 years earlier, Germany had invaded France through Belgium. The Schlieffen, Schlieffen, plan had sent German armies sweeping through neutral Belgium in a massive flanking maneuver. It had nearly worked. Only desperate counterattacks at the Marne, Marne, had stopped the Germans short of Paris. The French military remembered this. They'd lived through it. Many of the generals planning France's defense in the 1930s had been junior officers in 1914. They knew Germany didn't respect Belgian neutrality when it became inconvenient. And yet, they built their magnificent wall, and they stopped at the Belgian border, and they told themselves this time would be different. This time, Belgium's neutrality would hold. This time, the Ardennes were too thick for tanks. This time, they'd have warning. Standing in those underground fortresses in May of 1940, surrounded by the hum of generators and the quiet confidence of technological superiority, French commanders genuinely believed they'd solved the problem of modern war. They'd built something Germany couldn't break. They were right about that part. Germany didn't break it. Germany just ignored it. Spring 1940 arrived with deceptive calm. Germany had conquered Poland the previous September in a demonstration of what journalists were calling Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks and aircraft working in coordination, punching through defensive lines before anyone could react. But then, nothing. Winter settled over Europe. The fighting stopped. Diplomats whispered about negotiated settlements. Some optimists called it the phony war, a conflict in name only, where soldiers faced each other across borders but rarely fired shots. France used this time to mobilize. By May, they'd assembled nearly 3 million men under arms. The British Expeditionary Force had crossed the Channel, over 300,000 troops. Combined with Belgian and Dutch forces, the Allies actually outnumbered Germany's available divisions in the West. On paper, France looked strong. The Maginot Line stood ready. The army was deployed. But if you were paying attention, really paying attention, you could see the cracks forming. In March, a German aircraft made a forced landing in Belgium. Belgian authorities recovered documents from the wreckage, operational plans for a German invasion through the Low Countries. The plans were delivered to French intelligence. French generals studied them, nodded knowingly, and filed them away. See? This confirmed their assumptions. Germany would try to sweep through Belgium and the Netherlands, just like 1914. France would be ready. They'd move forces north to meet the threat. What they didn't consider, maybe Germany wanted them to find those plans. Throughout April, French reconnaissance aircraft reported unusual activity. German tank columns moving west, concentrating near the Luxembourg border. Not near the Maginot Line's strongest points, that would be suicide. And not spreading out for the expected thrust into central Belgium. They were gathering near the Ardennes. French intelligence officers wrote reports. The reports moved up the chain of command. And somewhere in that chain, someone looked at a map, saw the Ardennes forest, and decided the reports couldn't possibly mean what they appeared to mean. Tanks don't mass in terrain they can't cross. Obviously, this was a feint. A deception to draw French forces away from the real attack. General Maurice Gamelin, GMLN, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, was 77 years old. He'd been a staff officer in 1914. He'd studied maps his entire career. When subordinates brought him intelligence about German movements near the Ardennes, he was polite but dismissive. The primary thrust would come through central Belgium, he insisted. Northern France. The same route as last time, because that's where the terrain favored mechanized warfare. The Ardennes? The Ardennes were impassable to armor. Hills. Forests, narrow roads. A few determined Belgian defenders with anti-tank guns could hold that terrain indefinitely. German tanks would get tangled in the trees, strung out in vulnerable columns. It would be a slaughter. Gamelin had charts. Studies. Expert opinions from geography professors. He had decades of military experience telling him that modern armies needed room to maneuver, and the Ardennes offered no room. What he didn't have was humility. Here's where the story takes on an almost surreal quality. The French did position forces to defend the Ardennes. Sort of. They assigned the task to the 2nd and 9th Armies, units composed largely of reserve divisions. Not their best troops. Not their newest equipment. Older men. Fewer officers. Artillery from the Great War. These weren't the elite divisions holding the Maginot Line or preparing to rush into Belgium. The reasoning went like this: since nothing serious could possibly happen in the Ardennes, we'll put our weaker forces there. They won't see real combat. It's essentially a rest sector. Let that logic sink in for a moment. They identified their most vulnerable point and deliberately assigned their weakest defenders to guard it. The frontage made the problem worse. The Ninth Army alone was responsible for defending nearly 60 miles of terrain with just 9 divisions. That's 1 division per 7 miles, a stretch that military doctrine said should be defended by at least 3 times that number. The soldiers dug what positions they could, but there wasn't enough barbed wire, not enough concrete for proper bunkers, not enough of anything. When officers in the Ninth Army requested reinforcements, they were told resources couldn't be spared. The real battle would happen in Belgium. Everything was being positioned for the Great Wheeling Maneuver North. A junior intelligence officer, his name lost to history, wrote a memo in late April. He'd been analyzing the German movements. The concentration of armor near the Ardennes was too large, too deliberate to be a feint. He calculated that Germany had massed at least 40 divisions in that sector. 40. Including their entire panzer force, over 2,000 tanks. His memo made it to division headquarters. Someone stamped it received and placed it in a file cabinet. The officer, frustrated, reportedly told a colleague, "Either we're about to witness the stupidest German military decision in history, or we're making the stupidest mistake in ours." Meanwhile, Belgium was performing its own tragic dance of denial. King Leopold III wanted desperately to maintain neutrality. He'd watched what happened to Poland, caught between Germany and the Soviet Union, erased in weeks. His strategy was to convince Hitler that Belgium posed no threat, while simultaneously convincing France and Britain that Belgium would fight if invaded. This satisfied no one and helped no one. French generals wanted to coordinate defensive plans with Belgium. They wanted to move forces into Belgian territory before any German attack, to establish defensive lines at favorable terrain. Belgium refused. That would violate neutrality, Leopold insisted. It would give Hitler an excuse to invade. So France and Belgium maintained a strange fiction where they were allies who couldn't actually plan together. French forces waited at the border, ready to rush north the moment Germany invaded. But they couldn't preposition. Couldn't coordinate artillery. Couldn't establish proper communications. Everything would have to be improvised in the chaos of war. Belgian military leaders, privately, were terrified. They knew their army couldn't stop Germany alone. They had decent fortifications. Fort Eben-Emael, Ben-Ahl, guarded the critical Albert Canal, supposedly impregnable. But fortifications required armies to defend them, and Belgium had only mobilized around 600,000 troops to face potential millions. In early May, Belgian intelligence intercepted German communications suggesting an attack was imminent. They passed this to French headquarters. Gamelin acknowledged the reports and maintained his focus on central Belgium. The attack, he assured everyone, would come where he expected it. Let's descend from the general's maps to the foxholes. Private Jean Moreau, not his real name, but representative of thousands like him, was 34 years old, recalled to service from his job as a schoolteacher. He'd missed the Great War by being too young, which his fellow soldiers considered lucky. He'd been assigned to the Ninth Army, defending a sector of the Ardennes near Sedan. His letters home, preserved in archives, tell a different story than the official communiques. In April, he wrote, "The position is quiet. We hear rumors of German activity, but command says they're moving north. Still, something feels wrong. The forest is too quiet. At night, you can almost feel them out there, watching. By early May, we've been reinforcing our positions, but there's never enough material." Marcel jokes that we're building sandcastles. I told him to shut up. Nobody laughed. His unit had 9 officers for over 800 men. 3 of those officers had never commanded in combat. Their anti-tank guns were the model from 1918, effective against Great War armor, questionable against anything modern. They had no anti-aircraft weapons. When someone asked what they'd do if German Stukas appeared, the captain said air defense wasn't their responsibility. Moreau's last letter home was dated May 9th. "Something's different tonight. We can hear engines. Lots of them. Command says it's probably supply trucks. But trucks don't sound like that. Trucks don't make the ground vibrate." May 9th, 1940. Final hours before the storm. In Brussels, Belgian officials received credible intelligence that Germany would invade at dawn. They called a cabinet meeting. Ministers debated through the night whether to request immediate French assistance or maintain the fiction of neutrality a few hours longer. King Leopold went to bed believing he could still negotiate. In Paris, Gamelin reviewed disposition maps with his staff. Everything was positioned for the expected German thrust through central Belgium. Elite mechanized divisions ready to race north. Artillery prepared to support Belgian defenders. The Navy alerted for possible operations. When an aide mentioned the reports of armor concentrations near the Ardennes, Gamelin reportedly waved his hand dismissively. A diversion, he said. The main attack comes tomorrow, but not there. Never there. In London, Winston Churchill, only 4 days into his tenure as Prime Minister, received intelligence briefings that conflicted with French assessments. British analysts were concerned about the Ardennes sector. Churchill drafted a letter to Gamelin suggesting reinforcement of that position. He never sent it. Who was he, newly appointed, to question France's most experienced general? And in the Ardennes, in hundreds of foxholes and improvised positions stretching across those dark forests, French soldiers waited. Some slept. Some wrote letters. Some cleaned weapons they hoped they wouldn't need. Above them, the spring sky was clear. The moon illuminated the tree canopy in silver fragments. At 3:30 a.m., Private Moreau was on watch. He heard at first, a sound like distant thunder, but rhythmic. Mechanical. Growing louder. He squinted into the darkness across the river and saw lights. Hundreds of lights. Moving between the trees on the far bank. He reached for the field telephone to call headquarters. Before he could lift the receiver, the horizon erupted in flame. Here's the tragedy crystallized. In those final hours, 3 entirely different wars existed simultaneously. In Gamelin's headquarters, illuminated maps showed a coming battle that matched 1914's script. German forces would pour through Belgium. French armies would meet them in prepared positions. The war would settle into something manageable, predictable. Victory through defense. In Belgium, King Leopold still believed neutrality could be maintained. His ministers still thought they had time to decide. His generals still trusted that Fort Ebene would hold long enough for help to arrive. And in the Ardennes, in the dark forests the experts said were impassable, 7 panzer divisions, over 1,000 tanks, had spent the previous 48 hours carefully threading through narrow forest roads in the longest traffic jam in military history. Commanders had been told to advance with lights on, despite the risk, because speed mattered more than surprise. Engineers had reinforced bridges. Military police directed traffic at every intersection. The entire German armored spearhead had moved into position while French intelligence filed reports and generals dismissed concerns. The disconnect wasn't just between headquarters and the front line. It was between reality and assumption. Between what the maps showed and what was actually happening. Between what should be possible and what determined men were willing to attempt. At 05:35 hours on May 10, 1940, the German artillery barrage began. Not at the Maginot Line. Not in central Belgium. In the Ardennes. And in Paris, in that moment, thousands of carefully constructed assumptions began to collapse like a house of cards. But the true disaster, the moment that would define the entire campaign, was still 2 days away. Because the Germans weren't attacking the Ardennes to conquer a forest. They were attacking it to cross a river. A river that French doctrine said was the ultimate defensive barrier. A river called the Meuse, Myoz. Dawn on May 10 revealed what the darkness had hidden. Private Moreau and his fellow defenders of the 9th Army watched German aircraft fill the sky, not dozens, but hundreds. Stukas with their inverted gull wings and screaming sirens dove on Belgian positions to the north. Dornier bombers flew in perfect formation toward targets deeper in France. The air itself seemed to vibrate with engine noise. But the planes weren't attacking the Ardennes. Not yet. They were part of the deception, hammering Belgium and the Netherlands, drawing French attention exactly where German planners wanted it. Gamelin's headquarters received reports of paratroopers dropping on Belgian airfields, of armor crossing the Dutch border, of Luxembourg being occupied in hours. Everything matched expectations. The Great Wheeling Maneuver through Belgium had begun. Gamelin activated Plan D. Elite French mechanized divisions rolled north to meet the Germans in Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force advanced. Over 1 million men began the largest military movement in French history, rushing to positions they'd planned for months. Officers consulted maps and smiled grimly. This was the battle they'd prepared for. Behind them, in the Ardennes, something else was happening. German tanks had emerged from the forest roads. Not scattered or disorganized, despite threading through nearly 50 miles of difficult terrain, they'd maintained cohesion. Motorcycle reconnaissance units probed French positions. Infantry followed in trucks. The first skirmishes erupted along the border. French defenders fought back. They weren't cowards. They held positions against German infantry, inflicted casualties, even knocked out several tanks with their aging anti-tank guns. For a few hours on May 10, it seemed manageable. German attacks were being contained. The line was holding. But holding was never the German objective. The Meuse River cuts through the Ardennes like a natural moat. At Sedan, where it curves through steep-sided valleys, 19th-century military theorists had called it the Gibraltar of the North. The river runs wide and fast. The far bank rises in cliffs and heavily wooded slopes, perfect defensive terrain. A handful of defenders on those heights could slaughter thousands trying to cross. French doctrine treated the Meuse as an absolute barrier. Even if, somehow, German forces penetrated the Ardennes, they'd break themselves against the river crossing. Engineers had demolished bridges. Artillery positions commanded every approach. Machine gun nests overlooked the water from concrete pillboxes. Behind the river lay the main defensive line, properly fortified. On May 12, just 2 days into the invasion, German armor reached the Meuse near Sedan. They'd covered 50 miles of impassable terrain in 48 hours. French intelligence officers, receiving these reports, checked and rechecked their maps. The timeline seemed impossible. Tanks couldn't move that fast through forest. There had to be errors in the reports. But German General Heinz Guderian, Guderian, commanding the Panzer Corps, wasn't interested in what doctrine said was impossible. He'd spent the previous decade theorizing that tanks should be concentrated and used for rapid breakthrough, not dispersed as infantry support. Now he was proving his theories in real time. He gave his commanders a simple order: cross the Meuse on May 13. Not after artillery preparation. Not after infantry established bridgeheads. On the 13th. Because speed, momentum, was everything. Every hour they delayed gave France time to react, to reinforce, to stabilize. His officers thought he was insane. Cross a defended river with tanks still refueling from the advance? Against prepared positions? Without waiting for heavy artillery? Some quietly prepared for catastrophic failure. Guderian ignored them and refined his plan. May 13, 1940. 4 p.m. French soldiers defending the Meuse heights near Sedan heard them first, a sound like approaching locomotives. The sky darkened. Not with clouds. With aircraft. The Luftwaffe committed over 1,500 aircraft to support the Sedan crossing. Wave after wave of Stukas descended in precise intervals. The scream of their sirens, a psychological weapon as much as an audio phenomenon, could be heard for miles. Each plane dove nearly vertical, released its bombs at the last possible moment, then pulled up in a climb that pushed pilots to the edge of consciousness. The bombs weren't particularly accurate. They didn't need to be. The objective wasn't destruction, it was terror. Imagine being in those French positions. The bunkers shake. Dirt rains from ceiling supports. The noise makes thought impossible. You try to man your machine gun, but the next wave arrives before you can steady your hands. Then another wave. Another. For 5 continuous hours, the bombing doesn't stop. You can't communicate with adjacent positions because the telephone lines are severed. You can't see because dust clouds everything. You can't think because your entire world has become concussion and noise. Some defenders broke. Not cowards, anyone would break. They abandoned positions and fled toward the rear. Some stayed and fought, manning weapons with hands bleeding from vibration. But cohesion, the invisible glue that holds military units together, began dissolving under pressure no human nervous system was designed to withstand. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, German infantry crossed the Meuse in rubber boats. The first German soldiers to reach the far bank were engineers and assault infantry, specialists trained for river crossings. They carried inflatable boats that could hold 10 men. French machine guns, still operational despite the bombing, opened fire. Boats capsized. Men drowned in their equipment. Tracer rounds lit the twilight water in streaks of orange. But more boats kept coming. German machine guns on the east bank provided covering fire. Mortars dropped smoke rounds to obscure French sightlines. Individual squads of Germans found dead ground, small folds in terrain that offered shelter, and established tiny footholds on the west bank. By nightfall, perhaps 500 German infantry had crossed. They held maybe 200 yards of riverbank, clinging to rocky outcrops and shell craters. It should have been easy to contain. A single French counterattack with fresh troops could have pushed them back into the river. But the French units that could counterattack were in disarray. 5 hours of aerial bombardment had shattered communications. Battalion commanders couldn't reach regiment. Regiment couldn't reach division. Orders went undelivered. Reinforcements got lost on roads clogged with refugees fleeing the bombardment. And crucially, tragically, French doctrine said that river crossings took days to develop. The attack at Sedan had begun only that afternoon. Surely the Germans couldn't possibly expand their bridgehead tonight. Surely they'd need time to bring up heavy weapons. Surely a counterattack could wait until morning when proper coordination was possible. That assumption bought Germany the hours they needed. Through the night of May 13th, German engineers worked in the darkness, building pontoon bridges across the Meuse. Infantry expanded the bridgehead, pushing French defenders back from the riverbank. By dawn on May 14th, the first German tanks began crossing. In Paris, Gamelin's Situation Room displayed maps that bore little resemblance to reality. Reports arrived in fragments, often hours delayed. A message saying German forces were approaching the Meuse would arrive after they'd already crossed it. Updates contradicted each other. One report claimed the line at Sedan was holding, another said German tanks were already kilometers beyond the river. Gamelin, trained in an era when battles developed slowly over days, kept insisting the breakthrough at Sedan was localized. A penetration, yes, but penetrations could be contained. He ordered counterattacks. Those orders reached division headquarters. From there, they traveled to regiments that had lost contact with their battalions. The battalions were either retreating, surrounded, or simply gone. On May 14th, French reconnaissance aircraft spotted German armor columns racing west, not northwest toward Paris, but west toward the Channel coast. The pilots reported hundreds of tanks moving in coordinated groups, covering ground at speeds that seemed impossible. Intelligence officers plotted the positions and realized the nightmare. Guderian wasn't trying to fight his way through France. He was executing an end run. If German armor reached the coast, they'd cut off every Allied force that had advanced into Belgium. The entire Northern Army, over 1 million men, would be trapped. Someone at headquarters said what everyone was thinking: we've been flanked. Again. Through Belgium. Exactly like 1914. Except it was worse than 1914. In that war, armies moved at the speed of marching infantry. Now, tanks covered in a day what took weeks before. The Allies couldn't react fast enough because the tempo of warfare had fundamentally changed, and French doctrine hadn't changed with it. Gamelin began issuing orders for forces in Belgium to withdraw. But those forces were already engaged with German Army Group B, the feint that everyone had thought was the main attack. They couldn't simply disengage and march south. The roads were clogged. Belgian refugees streamed in every direction. Luftwaffe aircraft strafed anything that moved. Back at Sedan, the soldiers of the Ninth Army weren't making strategic calculations. They were trying to survive. Units that had been bypassed in the initial breakthrough found themselves behind German lines. Some fought their way back. Some surrendered. Some simply scattered into the countryside, soldiers without units, wandering through a landscape that had become utterly unfamiliar. A French tank battalion received orders to counterattack the German bridgehead on May 15. The orders were 36 hours out of date. By the time they arrived, the bridgehead was a corridor 20 miles wide. The battalion commander led his tanks forward anyway because orders were orders. They ran into German panzers, anti-tank guns, and Stuka support. The battalion ceased to exist as a fighting formation within 3 hours. The tragedy wasn't lack of courage. French soldiers fought and died defending positions they were told were critical. The tragedy was that the positions didn't matter anymore. The war had moved past them while headquarters still thought in terms of static defense and orderly lines on maps. By May 16, 6 days into the invasion, German armor had advanced over 100 miles from the Meuse. They were approaching the coast. Behind them, the gap in French lines had become a chasm through which entire German armies poured. Here's the final, crushing irony: the Maginot Line never fired a shot in anger during the crucial phase of the campaign. Those magnificent fortresses, those underground cities with their climate control and their railways and their artillery turrets, they stood fully manned, fully supplied, facing east toward Germany. The German forces opposite them made no serious attempt to attack. Why would they? The war was happening somewhere else. Soldiers in the Maginot Line listened to radio reports of disaster after disaster and asked their officers when they'd be redeployed to where the fighting was. The answer was always the same: hold your positions. The line must be maintained. So they held. They maintained. They watched through periscopes as the nation behind them collapsed. 300,000 French soldiers, some of the best equipped, best trained troops France possessed, stood in fortifications that had become tactically irrelevant the moment German tanks crossed the Meuse. All that concrete, all that planning, all those billions of francs, rendered meaningless not through defeat but through circumvention. The Maginot Line had done exactly what it was designed to do: it made the German-French border impregnable. The problem, the obvious, foreseeable, historically demonstrated problem, was that wars don't respect borders when those borders can be bypassed. By May 17, German tanks reached the Channel coast at Abbeville, Abbeville. The encirclement was complete. Over 1 million Allied soldiers were trapped in northern France and Belgium, cut off from supply, reinforcement, or retreat. The Battle of France had 9 more days left. But it was already over. The rest was just playing out the consequences of decisions made years earlier, when engineers drew lines on maps and generals convinced themselves that this time, would be different. It wasn't. By late May 1940, a strange quiet descended over certain parts of France. Not the silence of peace, the silence of shock. In Paris, cafes that had been packed with confident discussions of strategy now sat half empty. People gathered around radio sets, listening to announcers struggle to explain how the impregnable had been penetrated, how the modern had been outmaneuvered, how 6 weeks had undone what 20 years of preparation was supposed to prevent. The Maginot Line still stood. Its guns remained loaded. Its garrisons maintained their posts with the discipline of soldiers who hadn't yet accepted that the war had passed them by. They would continue holding those positions for weeks, even as German forces occupied Paris, even as France negotiated surrender. Some fortifications wouldn't surrender until July, their commanders following orders to defend positions that no longer defended anything. In the north, the trapped Allied armies fought desperately toward the coast. The evacuation at Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo, would become its own legend. Over 300,000 British and French troops rescued from the beaches by a flotilla of naval vessels and civilian boats. Churchill would call it a miracle of deliverance. But miracles come with costs. left behind on those beaches, every heavy weapon the British Expeditionary Force possessed. All their tanks. All their artillery. All their trucks and supplies. An entire army's worth of equipment abandoned in the sand. The soldiers were saved. The material was lost. And in the wreckage of the Sedan sector, where it all began, burial details worked through June identifying bodies and marking graves. French casualties in the Battle of France would exceed 90,000 dead. Nearly 200,000 wounded. Over 1.8 million captured, men who would spend the next 5 years in German POW camps. The Ninth Army, which had defended the Ardennes, effectively ceased to exist as a military organization. Some units retained cohesion. Most simply dissolved. A division that began the campaign with 15,000 men might finish with 3,000 scattered survivors. The global press struggled to process what had happened. Initial reports focused on the obvious drama: German forces sweeping through the Low Countries, the bombing of Rotterdam, the courage of Belgian and Dutch resistance. Those stories fit familiar patterns. Nations fighting against invasion. Heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. But as the scale of the Sedan breakthrough became clear, journalists found themselves reporting something unprecedented. The New York Times ran headlines like "Nazi wedge splits Allied armies" and struggled to explain how modern mechanized warfare had fundamentally changed the calculus of defense. British correspondents, writing under wartime censorship, couldn't fully describe the chaos of the retreat. They used euphemisms: tactical withdrawal, repositioning, consolidation of forces. Between the lines, readers sensed catastrophe. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels orchestrated triumphant coverage. Newsreels showed German tanks racing across French countryside, infantry marching past abandoned French equipment, crowds of prisoners. The footage was real. No exaggeration was necessary. The visuals told their own story of total operational collapse. French newspapers, before the occupation, published increasingly desperate communiques from the Ministry of War. May 15, situation remains under control. May 20, strategic readjustments continue. May 25, silence on the military situation, only instructions for civilian evacuations. By June, when German troops paraded down the Champs-Élysées, no spin could disguise the magnitude of defeat. France, which had possessed the largest army in Western Europe, which had built the most sophisticated fortifications in history, which had mobilized millions of men, had been defeated in 6 weeks. General Gamelin was relieved of command on May 19, replaced by General Maxime Weygand, VGAHN. The change came too late to affect the outcome. Weygand tried to organize new defensive lines, but he was assembling units that had already been shattered, using doctrines that had already failed. In the post-war years, when survivors wrote their memoirs and historians compiled their analyses, a question echoed through every account: how did everyone miss what was so obvious? The warnings had been there. Intelligence about German armor concentrations near the Ardennes. Historical precedent from 1914. Reports from junior officers that contradicted headquarters assumptions. Even the captured operational plans, which should have prompted deeper questions about German intentions. Each warning was dismissed, explained away, or filed under implausible. Because the defensive strategy, the Maginot Line strategy, had been set. Resources had been committed. Careers had been built on its success. Admitting it might be flawed would have required admitting that billions of francs and years of effort had been misallocated. So instead, the warnings were ignored. Not through malice. Not even through stupidity. Through the far more common human failing of believing what you need to believe. André Maginot, whose vision had shaped French defense, never witnessed the disaster. He died in 1932, shortly after construction on his line began. Perhaps that was mercy. The fortifications bearing his name would become synonymous not with security, but with the danger of static thinking in a mobile world. Military academies around the world studied the Battle of France with the intensity of surgeons examining a medical failure. The lessons seemed clear, yet proved surprisingly difficult to internalize. Lesson 1. Preparation for the last war is worse than no preparation at all. France had built fortifications designed to prevent a repeat of 1914's trench warfare. They succeeded completely. Germany didn't fight that war. They fought a different one. Lesson 2. Assumptions become dangerous when they're never tested. French generals assumed the Ardennes were impassable. They'd studied the terrain on maps, consulted experts, made calculations. What they never did was actually try to move armor through those forests themselves, under combat conditions, to see if their assumptions held. Lesson 3. Ignoring warnings because they contradict your plan is not strategy, it's hope. Every indicator that Germany was massing for an Ardennes breakthrough was dismissed because acknowledging it would have required abandoning the careful plans already in motion. Lesson 4. Speed matters more than strength when the enemy chooses where and when to strike. France had more divisions, more artillery, more fortifications. Germany had initiative and mobility. Initiative 1. The United States military, watching from across the Atlantic, began a massive re-evaluation of defensive doctrine. The Philippines had been fortified similarly to the Maginot Line, fixed positions meant to deter Japanese aggression. Those plans were quietly revised. 2 years later, when Japan did attack, the Philippines fell anyway, but at least American planners understood they were fighting a mobile war. The Soviet Union drew different lessons. They'd been moving toward mobile warfare already, but the French collapse accelerated their tank development programs. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, they employed the same breakthrough tactics that worked at Sedan. This time, the defender had learned. Soviet counterattacks, mobile, aggressive, willing to accept encirclement and fight their way out, eventually ground down the German advance through sheer operational flexibility. Today, you can visit the Maginot Line. Parts have been preserved as museums. You can descend into those underground chambers, walk through the ammunition magazines, see the dormitories where soldiers once slept. The artillery turrets still rotate, though they'll never fire again. Tour guides explain the technical specifications with pride. The engineering was genuinely impressive. 3-meter-thick concrete. Ventilation systems that could withstand gas attacks. Electric lighting throughout. Narrow-gauge railways for ammunition transport. It was all there, all functional, all irrelevant. Standing in those empty fortresses, you can almost feel the presence of the soldiers who manned them. Young men who believed these walls made them safe. Officers who'd studied at Saint-Cyr, France's military academy, convinced their strategy was sound. Engineers who'd calculated load-bearing capacities and reinforcement schedules with precision. All of them doing their jobs perfectly within a system designed to fail. The phrase Maginot Line mentality entered the lexicon as shorthand for defensive thinking that ignores changing circumstances. Businesses use it to describe companies that fortify their current products while competitors innovate around them. Politicians invoke it when warning against outdated policies. The military metaphor became a cultural one. But that metaphor sometimes obscures the human reality. The men who designed and defended the Maginot Line weren't cartoon villains or obvious fools. They were professionals working with incomplete information, constrained by budgets and politics, haunted by the trauma of the Great War, trying to ensure their nation never suffered like that again. They failed. But they failed the way most large-scale failures happen, through a series of reasonable-seeming choices that, in aggregate, produced catastrophe. Each individual decision made sense in isolation. Build fortifications where the border is vulnerable. Trust your allies' neutrality. Position weaker forces in terrain that favors defense. Focus resources on the most likely threat. The error was systemic, not individual. And systemic errors are the hardest to see from inside the system. In June 1940, after France signed the armistice, Hitler insisted on one symbolic gesture. The surrender would be signed in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered to end the Great War in 1918. The French delegation sat in the same seats where German generals had sat 22 years earlier, signing away their nation's sovereignty in the same location where Germany's had been taken. The railway car was preserved in a museum. The Germans took it to Berlin as a trophy. It was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid in 1945, history consuming its own artifacts. The Maginot Line survived both the war and the decades after. Modern France maintains portions of it, not as functional defense, but as memorial and warning. A reminder that security can't be purchased with concrete alone. That the wars we prepare for are rarely the ones we fight. That assumptions, left unexamined, become vulnerabilities. And perhaps most importantly, that the difference between fortress and trap is sometimes just a matter of where the enemy decides to attack. So we return to the question from the beginning: if you'd been shown a map in 1939, knowing Germany had invaded through Belgium 25 years earlier, would you have left your northern border exposed? The honest answer is, you might have. Because you would have been operating within the same constraints, the same assumptions, the same institutional pressures as the French High Command. You would have had experts telling you the Ardennes were impassable. You would have had allies promising to hold. You would have had concrete evidence, the Maginot Line itself, of France's defensive preparations. The lesson isn't that French generals were uniquely foolish. It's that all of us are vulnerable to this kind of failure. We build our strategies, our careers, our lives on assumptions we never quite examine. We invest so heavily in our chosen path that changing course becomes psychologically impossible. We see warnings but interpret them through the lens of what we already believe. The Maginot Line stands as a monument not to stupidity, but to the universal human struggle between preparation and adaptation, between learning from history and being trapped by it. History is filled with these forgotten lessons, moments where the best plans of capable people collided with reality and shattered. We're building an archive of these investigations, examining the decisions that shaped our world, extracting insights that remain relevant today. If you found value in this examination of how France's perfect defense became its greatest vulnerability, join us for the next investigation. Subscribe and become part of a community committed to understanding not just what happened, but why it happened, and what it means for the challenges we face now. Because the next Maginot Line won't be made of concrete. It might be a business strategy, a technological assumption, or a geopolitical certainty. But somewhere, someone is building it right now, convinced this time will be different. History suggests otherwise.